This volume is on the geopolitical implications, if you like, of the global meltdown, because the focus really is, not an analysis of the meltdown itself, but what are the implications, and that's the way I approach this chapter on India. One thing we know is that every economic crisis, every major global economic crisis has had a geopolitical consequence. More recently, for instance, the Asian economic crisis has had a major impact on the geopolitics of Asia. And so it's very clear that this particular crisis will also have geopolitical consequences. From the presentations you've already heard, the rise of China, increased influence of China globally is clearly one important geopolitical consequence. The other, which somebody asked the question about Europe, and I don't think we have a chapter focused on Europe as a whole, but individual parts of it. But I think certainly decline of European influence around the world is going to be another geopolitical consequence. And India, of course, recognizes that it is now operating in a changing world. And what I've tried to do in this chapter is to look at what are those concerns that a rising India faces as it deals with the consequences of the global economic crisis. The first question, of course, is, did the crisis have an impact on India? The answer is yes, it did. It was fashionable at one stage to argue that India was de-linked from the rest of the world, was less integrated globally, and therefore it's unlikely to be negatively impacted. But I think what we underestimated was the extent of our integration, particularly in the financial sector. Indian corporates had borrowed heavily internationally because of the low interest rates in the international markets, and access to global funding collapsed overnight, and many Indian companies were then looking at home for funding, and therefore there were consequences for financial policy at home. Secondly, in the management of our balance of payments, the remittances from Indians working overseas, particularly in the Middle East, is a large amount. Every year, the skilled Indian labor in the Middle East remits home several $1 billion, tens of billions of dollars. And the impact of not just the financial crisis, but also the collapse in energy prices on construction activity in the region meant that remittance flows had been hit. Large numbers of these workers were forced to go back home to India, and that had its impact. So overall, India did take an impact both on the financial, in terms of the financial integration and management of the balance of payments. On the trade side, the impact was not as significant, though Indian exports did come down sharply, partly because of the fact that India's trade share with Europe and the US has been going down, and India's trade dependence on Asia has been going up, and since many of the Asian economies continued to grow, the impact on overall trade was not as severe as one would have imagined. But what did it mean in sum as far as growth is concerned? As in the case of China, not a very significant hit on growth, though the IMF initially forecast a sharp decline, a 50% decline in the growth rate from the average of 9% that the Indian economy has had between 2003 and 2008. The IMF actually forecast decline in the growth rate in 2008, 2009 to 4.5%, but now we know that it's closer to 7%, and therefore 6.7 is the official estimate. So there it has taken a hit, a 2 percentage point decline, but it still remains the second fastest growing economy next to China. Well, I think the major consequence of the global crisis as far as India was concerned was the steep increase in public spending. And unlike in the case of China, the deficits, the fiscal and revenue deficits, or the budgetary deficits were already quite high, and they shot up. So as we go into the next 2 or 3 years, the financial years, fiscal management would be the second biggest challenge for India. I mean, the first biggest challenge, of course, is to get the trade figures up, to see an increase in trade, particularly with the US and Europe. But the second challenge would be to get the fiscal management back on track, reducing the trade, the revenue and the fiscal deficits. But what was the reason why the impact on the Indian economy was not as much as on many of the other developing countries? The simple answer is that India followed a very conservative policy on financial sector integration, for which in fact it was criticized in the years and months preceding the crisis, criticized on Wall Street, criticized in the US Treasury, criticized by the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, The Economist. It was repeatedly criticized for being conservative on opening up the banking sector and the financial sector. But I think that conservatism certainly paid off. And one policy consequence of what has happened in the last couple of years would be that we are not likely to see India moving very quickly onto capital account convertibility. I think like China, there would remain controls on capital account convertibility. But going forward, I think the biggest challenge for India as a result of the global economic crisis and the geopolitical impact is to revive global, is to see a revival of global demand, particularly demand in the West. Certainly, India remains concerned about its growing dependence on China and would want to ensure a more balanced distribution of its trade and investment flows. India would, I think, certainly like to see a much faster expansion of its trade and investment relationship with the United States and Europe. And to the extent that US and EU will take more time to recover, I think this will remain an area of concern. A related issue would, of course, be the kind of global trading regime that we are going to see put in place as a result of the Doha round. I think India has expressed repeatedly a strategic stake in the multilateral system, but a multilateral system that is supportive of India's developmental aspirations, and therefore getting a trading system in place that would enable Indian manufacturing growth to be sustained is going to be a challenge because of the kind of fears, particularly in this part of the world, with respect to imports and to trade openness. A second area of concern, of course, would be climate change and what kind of a regime we are going to have in place for dealing with global warming and carbon emissions. This is directly linked to the sustainability of 9 to 10% growth over the next quarter century or so. And I think bargaining and getting in place a regime that addresses both the challenge of global warming, but at the same time ensures that India can sustain growth will be a major issue coming out. I do discuss in the paper some larger issues coming out of the crisis. And certainly one significant issue that the crisis has thrown up is the entire debate about market versus government, or the state versus market. I spent the last year living in Singapore, listening, sitting through seminars and presentations like this, all focused on the global economic crisis. And certainly there is an element of, self-congratulation in many countries in the region that we have a more active government. Our state intervention has helped us. Asia has not been hit as much as the United States because of the role of the government. So I think in this debate about government versus market or state versus market, this crisis has in fact tilted the argument more in favor of state intervention. And naturally in India, this has been a major subject of debate, and many of us have been trying to actually reduce the role of the government and push the economy in the direction of greater marketization and opening up. And I think the way in which the debate unfolds here in the United States would certainly have an influence. The arguments in favor or against government intervention, I think these are important arguments, which also have incidentally geopolitical consequences, because they would the way in which the argument develops would justify the policies of various governments, and the attitude towards trade liberalization and so on and so forth. So I think we must be mindful of the fact that when we look at the performance of economies, we are not just looking at numbers. We are not looking at GDP figures. We are not looking at trade figures. We are looking at the ideas that underpin the process of that growth that has happened over the last quarter century, and what ideas are likely to be reinforced as we go ahead, what ideas are going to be discarded, what ideas are going to be dumped, what ideas will be rejected. I think this is an important intellectual challenge, particularly for those of us who believe in open societies and open economies. I think that is an important challenge that this crisis has thrown up. Indeed, as the last crisis in the interwar period threw up, I mean, it is natural for nations to become nervous as they live through a crisis, as employment rates go down, as production goes down. We've seen the kind of nervousness that the depression generated in Europe, and I think we need to be mindful of the fact that governments around the world are nervous as a result of what has happened, and nervousness has political consequences, and I think we need to be mindful of that. Finally, the challenge for India as it moves forward would be to ensure that the global trading system remains open and remains accommodative of its own growth aspirations, and the global financial system is more representative, and the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. These institutions reflect the new balance of global power, as it were, because they're really vestiges of the last depression and the last the distribution of power after the last war, and we have 60 years down the road. And India will seek a more representative global financial system as we go forward. I just add with one word that India would want to remain within the global system, and I don't see India particularly excited about Asian alternatives. There is this whole Chiang Mai initiative, multilateralization, and ideas about an Asian monetary fund, which is quite popular. I was in Manila last week at a seminar at the Asian Development Bank, and I can tell you there's a lot of enthusiasm for some of these ideas among economists in the region. India does not share that enthusiasm. I think India would like to see the IMF strengthened and reformed and made more representative, rather than compete with new institutions in the region, which certainly would see a larger share or a larger voice for China, which is something India would remain concerned about.